Tomorrow, the public hearings of the Public Order Emergency Commission begin. The Commission will be scrutinizing the events leading up to, including, and following the federal government's decision to declare a public order emergency in February of this year. I want to be clear about the CCLA's position. The protests needed to be addressed, but the government also had an obligation to comply with the law and use emergency powers as a truly last resort. That was not the case, and it is our opinion that their actions were unlawful and unconstitutional. We are going into the Commission with an open mind, but in our view, the government has yet to prove that the legal threshold to invoke the Act was met, and the burden is on them, not the other way around. This is what we will be focusing on at the Commission: the federal government's decision to invoke the Act and the constitutionality of the emergency orders that it put in place. As a participant in the inquiry with full standing, we will vigorously test the government's evidence and demand that the government is held to account for its actions. We believe that the inquiry must address several important questions, including, first and foremost, was the legal threshold for invoking the Act met? Were there genuine concerns about threats to national security, or was the government largely concerned about the economic impacts of the blockades? What evidence supported the government's view that there was a threat to security or a serious threat to the lives, health, or safety of Canadians? Why, according to the government, were existing laws inadequate to address the emergency? What alternatives did the government consider? Could legislation passed on an expedited basis have avoided the invocation of the Act? Why were the emergency orders drafted so broadly? When the protests were localized, why was application to the entire country considered necessary? How did the protests and blockades impact the rights and freedoms of people in Canada? And perhaps more significantly, how did the emergency orders that were put in place impact the rights and freedoms of people in Canada? When the Emergencies Act was first proposed as a bill, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association advocated for meaningful oversight and accountability mechanisms to ensure that the gross violations of civil liberties that had taken place under the War Measures Act would not be repeated. The Commission of Inquiry is an important accountability mechanism, and the CCLA is looking forward to helping to ensure that it is a meaningful one. The inquiry will also provide the broader Canadian public with the opportunity to gain a greater understanding of the events that took place and come to their own conclusions about some of the issues at play.
Just specify more
Sure.
why that matters and what the distinction is?
Yeah, so the federal government declared a state of emergency using the Emergencies Act, and then the executive branch passes these executive orders that are the things that say you can't gather, that financial institutions have obligations to freeze assets of people who are designated individuals. Those are the things that the government could have done by way of legislation that would have benefited from parliamentary scrutiny in advance rather than after the fact. So,
but what is the difference between Parliament voting to invoke it and the scrutiny that comes with that versus having these new laws on an expedited manner in which they might skip over the committee process anyways? I don't understand the distinction.
Well, the distinction is that you have Parliament weighing in before the measures are in place instead of after the fact. So by the time Parliament approved the state of emergency, those orders were already in place. They were already operational. And I think also what I was mentioning before about some of the confusion around the scope of the orders, that's also something that might have been addressed had there been debate in Parliament in advance.
And then I just wanted to get your sense on the commission generally. Are you satisfied that the witnesses that are listed and the setup of the commission is actually going to get to the heart of the question as to whether the government met the threshold? Because we're not hearing from the provinces. We're not hearing from Doug Ford, for example. The accountability for policing is with the municipality and the province. And the federal government had to step in because it fell apart at those levels. So are you satisfied that we will actually get the answers you're looking for?
So I don't know yet. I think we have to see what happens during the course of the public hearings. I mean, we are hearing from municipalities that were affected. We are hearing from witnesses from Ottawa, the Ottawa Police Service, the Ottawa Police Services Board, members of council. I think, I think there's also questions around what will be held back, and that's one of the things that I don't have a good handle on yet. I know what documents have been put forward, but I don't know what documents have been held back or the reasons for that. And those are some of the things that I think will be explored over the course of the hearing. So I think we will have questions about whether the government is being forthcoming enough, whether the evidence is going to allow the kind of transparency that we think is required. And I can say that already, the timeline that the commission is working under is set out in the statute, so they are stuck with it. They are stuck with having to, put a final report before Parliament in February of 2023. That's a very short timeline, especially given the fact that the government waited almost the full 60 days that they had to actually name the commissioner. So that's 2 months that were lost that could have been used to start gathering evidence. And I think that, they have a very ambitious schedule, the commission. There's a lot of witnesses they want to hear from. There are a lot of documents to get through. There's also a whole policy phase. So I think it's still to be decided. And one of the things that, that may come out of this process are recommendations about amendments to the Act around this process in particular. Do we need more time for an inquiry? Do we need specifics in the legislation that would address whether the government can hold things back from the commission, or whether everything needs to be provided?
David Fraser, Canadian Press.
Hi, just following up on my colleague's question there regarding transparency. How confident are you in the government's commitment to transparency? Are you concerned at all the government will try to shield evidence from being made public by having it presented in camera just to the commissioner? And can you comment on how your confidence level in the government's ability to be transparent has been impacted, if it has been impacted at all, by CCLA's ongoing judicial challenges taking place now as well? Thanks.
Yeah, so I do have concerns about the level of transparency that the federal government, has been displaying throughout this process. When we've also sought judicial review of the decision to invoke the Act, and so there's been discussions about documents and about cabinet confidentiality in that context. And it's not that we don't recognize that there's a sphere of activities that the government rightfully can protect. But one of the things that the Emergencies Act requires is an explanation that gets put before Parliament about why the Act why it was necessary to declare an emergency. For me, that document is the government's answer. And if they start to say, well, there are other things, but we can't share them, or there are other things that we're not at liberty to disclose publicly, I think that's a problem in terms of not being forthright with Parliament and not being forthcoming with the Canadian public.
Just as a follow-up, outside of what the government actions at the judicial review level, has there been anything specific to the commission process that has, carried forward your concerns a little bit more, or made you think those concerns more?
I think it's probably still too soon to tell. Certainly, I was anxious to get access to a documentary database long before it was made available to me. But I appreciate that the individuals that are working on the commission are also dealing with, with a huge challenge in terms of all of the material that needs to be reviewed, and also the back and forth that they're engaged with the parties that have that evidence. So I think it's a huge undertaking. But like I said, we are going into this with an open mind. We want to hear from the witnesses. I think the commission, I have every reason to believe that the commission process will be a robust one. And a lot will depend on how forthcoming the witnesses that appear are.